Thanks so much, Bronwyn. Thanks very much, Edward, for organising all this. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming to discuss a subject which has been pretty much taboo over the last 3 years in this country and in this city, which is what do the Russians actually think about what's going on. And it's striking to be taboo. I have friends, journalists, professors, whatever, who have almost been cancelled for suggesting that they might write an article or a book trying to explain what motivates the Russians. So I'm delighted to be able to try and persuade those of you who were not wise enough to vote for us the first time around that there are very good reasons for believing that Russians were actually provoked into what they're doing. Let me start with a quibble, however. By provoked, I do not mean that this was the sole cause of what the Russians did. What I'm saying is that it was, I'm sure you're all Aristotelian philosophers, it was a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the Russian action. It contributed substantially to what the Russians are crazy. I'm not defending the Russians, the crazy, brutal things the Russians have done, but it was not the only cause. Russian point of view I've talked about. I think as I go through, you will see that I'm focusing on the Russian point of view because the question of whether the Russians were provoked finally comes back to what's going on in Russian heads. In particular, of course, one Russian head, which is President Putin. A couple of other points I need to emphasize before I get going properly. You need to understand the deep importance of Ukraine for Russia. Ukraine, Slavic sister, united with Russia for about as long as Scotland has been united with England. I've become more cautious about using that analogy. And the relationship, as vexed as any relationship between a municipal imperial power and one of its colonies, think England and Ireland. All the undertones and complications in that sort of relationship. And the fourth point I would make is about Russia itself. That over the period we're discussing, and indeed still to some extent, the deep cleavage in Russian politics, nothing to do with the political parties or any of that, it's been liberal reformers, Democrats, on the one hand, people we encouraged, generated when communism originally collapsed, but have been between the conservative, nationalist, on the whole authoritarian, on the whole very hostile to the West alternative group. And the interplay between those two groups has been a big part of the Russian approach to all of this. And part of my thesis is at the end of this process, we've actually given dominance in Russian politics to the wrong guys, to the nationalists, to the Putinites, if you like. Okay, I'm now going to run through very swiftly, as swiftly as I can, aware of Bronwyn's eagle eye upon me there.
As long as swiftly as you can.
The actual history of the key issue as I see it in pushing Russia the wrong way on all of this, which is Western determination to expand NATO. You come to the Cold War, remember the Cold War? When I talk about the Cold War to students in Cambridge, so it means if I'm talking about the Trojan War, I'm rather hopeful here that there's a bit more historical memory of that. At the end of the Cold War, you have two still surviving just alliance systems. NATO on the one hand, also on the other hand, both of them saying we're defensive. What we've done for the last 30 years is defend our side of the argument against the other. And the Warsaw Pact, of course, and the other point about them is that each is regarded by the population of the other side as the deep enemy, as the people who are out to get us, out to conquer us. Okay, get into the Cold War, Warsaw Pact disappears because nobody wants to be a subject of Russia. NATO survives, but there's quite a lot of expectation around, including by me, that it's got to go. The Cold War's over, we're talking about a Europe whole and free, all of that sort of stuff. It's a historic relic which will vanish. And it kind of feels like that for a very short time. And then the question of NATO expansion arises, first of all, in a negative way. Gorbachev, as the Cold War literally ends, as Germany wants to unify, as East Germany joins up with West Germany a member of NATO, East Germany not, question comes, okay, can we include East Germany in NATO? And obviously the answer to that is yes, there's no great cost to that. What sort of price is Russia willing to pay to allow that? And what the Americans, what Jim Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, offers is not 1 inch. NATO will take in East Germany, but will not go 1 inch beyond that line. He says it. Now, people say, because the conventional negotiations do not put that commitment into the final agreement, but he says it in public, Kohl repeats it, Thatcher repeats it, Werner, who was at the time Secretary General of NATO, repeats it. It is generally accepted by the Russians that that is a commitment by the West, even if not written down. And when we come to the point of the subsequent debate, and the West said, of course we never meant it. Of course NATO can expand if we choose to do it. The Russians come away feeling betrayed. You could say, okay, it wasn't in the agreement, this is true, but Mr. Gorbachev was much more worried about money than he was about security when the deal was done. At regular moments thereafter, you find the Russians saying, but you promised, and you broke your promise. This is the moment where trust began to evaporate between the two sides as a result of a Western action. Okay, so that's the initial play, and then it all goes quiet for a bit because the Soviet Union is busy collapsing. NATO, as I say, is cast to one side. Warsaw Pact also collapses. And the subject raises itself again with the expansion of NATO, actually under middle period Clinton, when people like the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs, now relieved of the Russian yoke, say we want to join NATO. We want protection from the Russians. And Clinton's initial reaction is caution, because he knows that this will be red rag to a Russian bull if he concedes it. He looks for ways of avoiding it. He introduces a thing called Partnership for Peace, which is a sort of waiting room for the eventual thing. And he talks regularly to Yeltsin. He and Yeltsin were quite close buddies in some ways. Yeltsin saying, don't do it. This is the way to really inflame my security sector. They will hate you. And Clinton, for a while, survives on that, but then he does very badly in the 1994 midterms, partly because in Chicago there are lots of Polish heritage voters who firmly back letting Poland into NATO. So Clinton switches. He says, okay, we're going to let them in. And there's then a huge row. Yeltsin, having been delighted by Partners for Peace, is utterly abject. And the torrent of political, you can guess the word I would have put in there in less graceful company, which is about to come on his head. Clinton pushes forward some negotiations. He produces a thing called the Founding Act, of which Clinton says, okay, our borders move 500 miles closer to Moscow. We absorb all of Russia's former allies. And then we give them this piece of paper as a compensation for what they're about to do. And meanwhile, Yeltsin is making speeches about a cold peace. There's a real chill enters the relationship between Russia and the West. Nevertheless, a friend of mine, a guy called Dmitry Trenin, who's one of the sort of hash-trained Russian bureaucrats, says to me, you do this and the Russian security sector will never trust you again. The Russian security sector matters. It's a dominant bit of the Russian government. Anyway, we go ahead. And a man called George Kennan, who was the great Russian expert, the man who devised the policy of containment way back at the beginning of the Cold War, who knows Russia backwards, looks at it in horror and says, I'm going to give you the full quotation here, because he's so good, he gets it absolutely right. Bluntly stated, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not in our interests. And he's absolutely right on every count. Nevertheless, by now the process has started, moving forward. First expansion takes place in 1990, first enlargement takes place in 1999, which unfortunately is also the year of the Kosovo War. I won't bore you with the details of the Kosovo War, but the Kosovo War was illegal. It was an attack on an ally of Russia, and it was an aggressive war on NATO's part. So the Russians turned around and said, I thought you said NATO was defensive. What is going on here? And at the same time, Gaigar, who is the leading reformer in Russia, says, if you only knew the disaster that you are now inflicting on Russia, you are making it impossible for those of us who care, he's a liberal, care about Russian liberalism and democracy, to achieve that result. First enlargement happens, goes away, leaving a very bad feeling and leaving a lot of damage around. One of the consequences, however, in a way, of that first enlargement of 1999 is that Yeltsin, choosing his successor, looking for a man who will protect the people around him, but also a man, final words to him are, look after Russia, who will protect Russia against its enemies. He picks a man who, amongst other things, is deemed as being ready to stand up to the West, Vladimir Putin. So part of the consequence of NATO enlargement is that we now have Putin to deal with. He arrives, he sets about taking care of Russia, he makes himself clear he's absolutely averse to NATO enlargement. At the beginning, actually, he wants to go soft, he wants to make friends with the Americans, all of that. He talks politely about NATO enlargement, but once it becomes clear that he cannot establish a decent relationship with the Americans, he then goes hard against it. You now move, so the second round of enlargement takes place in 2004. I actually just arrived in Russia as ambassador in that year. And one of the things I was put down to do, we were all doing it, all NATO ambassadors, was going around the country, meetings of Russians, ordinary Russians, and so explaining NATO's defensive alliance. Of course, we're not planning to attack Russia. And I went to one of these meetings in Ekaterinburg, got up and said all of that, gave all the arguments, and then a bloke, ramrod straight, ex-veteran Russian, got up and said, "Почему нам врешь? Why are you lying to us?" Evident support from all the other people in the room. And that brought home to me how strongly ordinary Russians felt about this issue. And the initial obvious environment in the enlargement take place, the attention now turns to Ukraine. Because Brzezinski once said, with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. Without Ukraine, you never can. Ukraine is the focal point in terms of the enlargers who want it inside NATO. Now, there's lots of coming and going in Ukrainian politics, which is basically a push and shove between the West and Russia. There was a revolution in 2004, which puts an anti-Russian president in Ukraine. And at that point, Ukraine can begin talking quietly to NATO about joining expansion. He disappears, he's replaced by a pro-Russian. But before that, the Bucharest summit, NATO Bucharest summit in 2008, which by some completely mad process includes in its conclusions, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And at this point, all sorts of things happen. Bill Berg, who was the US ambassador in this time, writes a telegram to his bosses in Washington saying, for all Russians, taking Ukraine into NATO, mentioned the importance of Ukraine, is the reddest of red lines. But every Russian we know, from the knuckle-dragging internal inhabitants of the Kremlin to the most liberal of liberals, they all hate the idea that this is their Slavic brother joining the enemy. Ukraine joins again, revolution of dignity. NATO entry is actually written into the Ukrainian constitution at that time. Putin, now things again have gone relatively quiet, but Putin goes off through COVID, broods on it all, sees, as I say, Russia's closest comrade not being dragged, voluntarily joining, voluntarily entering Ukraine, comes back from his COVID-induced break, says, I'm not going to let this happen. This is contrary to what all of Russian history is about. Masses his troops, presents a set of demands to the West, saying that it's central is that Ukraine will not join NATO. We, the West, rush on the side, and the war starts. So I conclude, just to summarise them, the Russians have regularly and forcefully told us that NATO expansion is simply not acceptable. Putin told Bush, Bucharest, we have to worry about our domestic security. You include Ukraine in NATO. He doesn't quite say that's a casus belli, but he uses diplomatic words which amount to the same message. We ignore it all the way down, and well, I'm now going to pay the price for that. Thank you.